Welcome to The Explainer. So today, we're tackling one of the biggest, most foundational claims in all of history, the resurrection of Jesus. But here's the twist. We're going to look at it from a pretty unique angle, through the eyes of someone who calls themselves a rationalist.
You know, this line right here, it's from the Apostles' Creed, and it packs in some of Christianity's most, challenging claims. I mean, rising from the dead, ascending to heaven. For a lot of people, that's just straight up impossible, supernatural stuff. So the question is this just a matter of blind faith, or is there more to it? Well, today we're going to explore a really fascinating case from a self-proclaimed rationalist, someone who argues there's actually a logical reason to believe in all this. So yeah, let's dive in. All right, first things first. Our source, this rationalist, he starts by kind of laying out his personal framework. He's skeptical of pretty much anything outlandish. We're talking conspiracy theories, supernatural claims, even alternative medicine. Basically, if it sounds weird, he's not buying it.
And he makes it really clear right from the start. His goal isn't to convince anyone. It's more like he's opening a window into his own thought process. He's really just answering one simple question. How does someone like him, a super rational person, end up believing in the resurrection, the ascension, and even the second coming?
Okay, so let's start with the resurrection. The speaker begins by looking at the earliest, most official testimony we have. And this comes from the Apostle Paul, recorded in his first letter to the church in Corinth.
So Paul lays out what seems like this airtight list of witnesses, right? You've got major leaders like Peter and James, the 12 apostles, and then this huge group of over 500 people. And Paul even says, hey, most of them are still alive, go ask them. But for our rationalists, this just wasn't enough. It's too neat. He's thinking, couldn't they have all just gotten together and decided to tell the same story? What if it was all collusion?
And this is where it gets really interesting. Ironically, the thing that convinced him wasn't this strong early list of witnesses. No, it was the accounts that came later, like 10 or 20 years later in the Gospels. The accounts that, on the surface, actually seem a lot weaker. So here's the absolute core of his argument. If you look at Paul's account, it's all official, male witnesses. That's exactly what you'd expect if you were building a strong legal case. But then you look at the Gospels, and all four of them agree on one crucial detail. The very first people to find the empty tomb were women. And that one detail, it's everything. You have to understand, back in that culture, a woman's testimony meant nothing in a legal sense. It literally wouldn't hold up in court. So think about it. If you're making up a story, if you're trying to pull off a huge hoax, why on earth would you make women your primary witnesses? The speaker's point is, you just wouldn't. It's the worst possible strategy. It completely torpedoes your credibility from day one.
And then there's another layer to this. He points out all the little inconsistencies between the four Gospels. You know, one account mentions one angel, another says there were two. The exact number of women is a little different here and there. Now, if this was a coordinated lie, he argues, they'd have gotten their story straight. It would be identical. The fact that it's not perfect, that it has these slight differences, that, to him, smells like real life. It sounds like genuine, messy, human testimony from people trying to remember a completely shocking event. All right, let's switch gears and talk about the ascension. You know, the claim that Jesus is seated at the right hand of God. For this part of the argument, the speaker zooms in on a really dramatic and frankly deadly chain of events.
So unlike the resurrection, where you have all these supposed witnesses, the Bible only mentions one person who explicitly claims to have seen Jesus at God's right hand. Just one. And it was a deacon named Stephen. And this wasn't some casual remark. To say that a man was sitting at God's right hand was basically saying he was God's equal. It was claiming divine status for him. And to the crowd listening, this was the worst kind of blasphemy imaginable. I mean, they literally covered their ears, started shouting, and then and there, they dragged him out and stoned him to death. So that sets up a pretty critical question, doesn't it? If you know that saying this one thing will get you killed, like immediately, who in their right mind would ever dare to repeat it? Well, the answer is just shocking. It's Paul, the same guy who was standing right there, holding the coats, authorizing Stephen's execution. After his own famous conversion, Paul starts making that exact same claim over and over again in his letters. And he knew exactly what he was saying. He knew it was a death sentence. So for the rationalist, the logic is pretty straightforward. Why would Stephen die for something he knew was a lie? But maybe even more powerful is the second question. Why would the guy who approved his execution turn around and risk his own life for that exact same belief?
For our speaker, that willingness for both of them to seal their testimony with their own blood, well, that's what he found so powerful.
Okay, so what's the bigger picture here? What does all this actually mean? Why were these two events, the resurrection and the ascension, so incredibly important to Jesus' earliest followers? Well, for them, it was all about the fulfillment of a really ancient hope.
You see, both Peter and Paul kept pointing back to the same place, this 1,000-year-old prophecy from King David, written down in Psalm 16. They looked at what happened to Jesus and saw the ultimate fulfillment of those ancient words.
And our speaker kind of breaks down what that psalm is all about. It basically paints a picture of the ideal life of faith, right? You trust in the one true God, you live by his words, and if you do that, the promise is life, protection, and a future inheritance.
But there was a huge problem. For 1,000 years, that's all it was, a hopeful promise. Nobody had ever actually done it. No one had conquered death, not even King David himself. I mean, everyone knew where his tomb was. So the promise, for all those centuries, it just felt empty.
And this is the big theological aha moment. The apostles came along and basically declared that with Jesus, something totally new and extraordinary had happened. The chain of history was finally broken. He was the one single exception who made that ancient prophecy a reality. And for them, it was the ultimate proof that God really does keep his promises.
So this all leads to the final, and maybe most important question, so what? Why does any of this history and theology even matter today? Well, the speaker connects it all directly to how we choose to respond to the evil and the injustice that we see all around us in the world.
He lays out two pretty common ways people respond when it feels like evil is winning. The first is basically cynicism, right? The whole if you can't beat 'em, join 'em attitude. The second is to take matters into your own hands, fight fire with fire. But he contrasts that with what he calls God's way. And this way is all about trust and obedience. It means you deliberately stay away from evil, you live righteously, and you respond to injustice not with your own personal revenge, but with God's principles of love and justice.
And that brings everything full circle. For this rationalist, these beliefs about the resurrection and ascension, they're not just some abstract historical ideas. The belief that God is ultimately going to make everything right is a direct challenge, a call to live a completely different way, right here, right now. And that leaves us with a really big, provocative question to think about. If this belief is supposed to completely transform how we act, what does that actually look like in the middle of our messy, complicated, and often really unjust world?